Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm delighted to welcome David Smith back. It's economics editor of the Sunday Times. Who, those of you who have joined our sessions before, we've done about three or four with David in the past, and they've all been hugely illuminating. And I sort of tactically put this session in post MPC, post election, but before budget, so that we sort of, and I didn't actually plan it on necessarily think about it being the day after Rachel Reeves' speech either. That one had sort of caught me, but we're sort of here at a point where obviously interest rates are, the path of interest rates seems a little bit clearer than when we last spoke, and obviously we have a big fiscal event in 5 or 6 weeks. So looking forward to chatting to David. So the usual format for those that haven't joined, where David will speak for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we've got 15, 20 minutes of questions at the end. Then maybe I may ask questions along the way if they seem relevant. At the bottom right, there is on your Zoom panel, there should be a Q&A. If you could put them in there, that would be great. And as I said, we'll take some maybe as we go along, but the rest will, broadly speaking, leave to the end. So on that note, I'll pass over to David.
Thanks very much, John. It's a great pleasure to be back talking to you again, albeit remotely. And I met some of you privately a few months ago. A lot has changed in the period we've been doing these webinars, and as John says, another change is due. On the screen there, you see who I am, and that's my Twitter handle in the bottom right-hand corner. I don't know whether we're supposed to be on Twitter these days now. Elon Musk has gone a bit weird, but I still am. I'm still flying the flag on Twitter for any of you who are tweeters or Twitterers. So that's where I am. So I want to talk about the economic and business outlook under Labour, and I want to divide that into a few different segments, as it were. You know, we have it's now a few weeks since the new government took office. Things haven't gone entirely smoothly. I think one thing that surprised me about the new government is how well prepared, by contrast, Labour was in 1997. You know, they really had worked out in many respects what they were going to do, particularly Gordon Brown and his team at the Treasury. And I'm not saying that that Rachel Reeves is not prepared, but things are very different. You know, things are very different under this government than the previous Labour government in its early weeks. And you've seen all the stuff about hospitality and football tickets and so on, which I think has been very unfortunate, and so on. So it hasn't been a great start. So we have to see what's coming up. So I want to talk about one thing that's obviously been emphasised by Rachel Reeves yesterday and Keir Starmer today, which is the government's inheritance, economic inheritance, and how good or bad was that. Then I want to try and talk about what will be in the October 30 budget. You know, what we're expecting there in broad terms is that the government will be aiming to raise quite a bit in tax, perhaps 15 to 20 billion in extra tax, but it will spend most of that extra public spending, a more realistic, perhaps envelope for public spending. Interest rates, we've already had the first small cut from the bank, obviously a bigger cut last week from the Fed. So what's going to happen next on that? And just to look at these longer term ambitions that Labour has got. Wants to build 1.5 million new houses over the course of this Parliament, and it wants the UK to be the G7's best performer in growth. So I'll have a look at that, cast perhaps a sceptical eye over both of those ambitions. So in terms of the first thing, how good or bad? The context for the new government, of course, is that as I sometimes mention, we've had these series of shocks. Global financial crisis, the 2016 Brexit and the election of Donald Trump. Pandemic, of course, we've all lived through previous pandemics, but none of which had the same kind of economic implications as this one. We've never had lockdowns before. And then, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So that series of shocks, I sometimes call them the four economic horsemen of the apocalypse. And I was taking, I don't know, I told you the story before. I was taking part in a pub quiz, and one of the questions that came up: can you name the four horsemen of the apocalypse? They weren't mine, but for future reference, in case you're ever taking part in such a quiz and it comes up, they are war, famine, death, and conquest. So keep that one in mind. So the inheritance. I mean, it's in economic terms, and this is the interesting thing. I think it's not that bad. Growth. We've just been through a parliament where growth was exceptionally weak. We had the obviously the plummet in GDP during the pandemic. Biggest ever quarterly fall by some margin, nearly 20% in the second quarter of 2020, followed by a recovery, an inevitable recovery as restrictions were lifted. Then, from the beginning of 2022 until the end of last year, the economy flatlined. Since which time it's picked up a bit. A couple of quarters of reasonably strong growth, 0.7 and 0.6%. So in that respect, growth has returned. This is an economy that's getting over the last couple of those shocks. It's better than it was. The last parliament was terrible, but growth has come back. And of course, inflation has come down a lot more quickly than people would have feared. I was looking at the figures for the OECD average inflation, average for advanced economies. And the average for advanced economies is still up at around 5 or 6%. So for us to get back to target, and of course we've just slipped above that now, it was pretty good, really. I mean, I don't think until people factored in what was going to happen to gas prices over the course of the past 12 to 18 months, anybody really expected we'd get back to 2% as quickly as we did. So that is a good result. It's for a long time, the UK was a laggard in terms of having much higher inflation than the Eurozone and the US, but that's now changed. I mean, all the Eurozone and the US are within sight of 2%. We got there first, I think, and it's been an unexpectedly good record. The problem, of course, is fiscal. I didn't have time to slot in words from Rachel Reeves's speech yesterday, but this is what she said in July once she'd asked the Treasury to have a look at the fiscal inheritance. And the interesting thing about this is that when we were before the election and during the election campaign, everybody knew that there was a black hole in the public finances. But it wasn't this black hole. It was the one that was going to emerge in the time of the budget, which was that the public spending plans were unrealistically tight, and of course Jeremy Hunt had made the fiscal position even more difficult with two successive cuts in national insurance. This one was different. This was the one that she has chosen to emphasize was the in-year black hole. Obviously, not all of it was due to what the Tories had done. Some of it was due to her decision to fund public sector pay rises. But she gives some indication of how difficult this would have been and what it would have meant for gilt issuance and so on. So the idea that they inherited a very difficult fiscal situation is one that Labour has chosen to emphasise. I think I would describe this as more of a grey hole than a black hole, in the sense that at least half of it is due to public sector pay rises. Maybe they wouldn't have been as high if the Tories had stayed in office. Maybe we'd have had more problems in industrial relations in the public sector. But even so, there were some areas such as the cost of housing asylum seekers in hotels, which were generally a lot higher than were in the plans. And the OBR effectively endorsed this by saying there were things happening in public spending that they didn't know about. When you look at the numbers that we've had, the cumulative numbers, what this chart shows is that what should be happening to public sector borrowing this year is the sort of purpley red line there. It should be running below last year's levels, which is the blue line. Whereas, in fact, as you can see, so far we've had 5 monthly readings in this fiscal year, the public sector borrowing is running at pretty much exactly what it was a year ago, which would suggest that instead of being 100 billion or below this year, we're looking at something like 120, 125 billion. So there's definitely an overshoot there. And as you'll also be aware, we've just gone back to public sector debt, public sector net debt, back to 100% of GDP. There's nothing magical about this that 100% figure, but the sheer numbers are quite disturbing. I think I was looking at in 2008 we had public sector net debt of 550 billion, and now it's 2.7, 2.8 trillion. So we've got 5 times the amount of debt. In the early 2000s, it was 30% of GDP. Now it's 100% of GDP. So the trajectory is pretty alarming. And people will look at those, the history and say, well, we've been higher before. We were higher at the end of the Second World War, higher at the end of the First World War. But there is a mechanism for getting it. But there was a mechanism for getting public sector debt down after those wars, demobilization, moving back to a peacetime economy, and also financial repression. Lots of people were able to, and institutions bought gilts, even though the returns on them were pretty useless in the context of the inflation we had over that period. And so the worrying thing about the rise in debt we've had recently is that there's no obvious way of reducing it relative to GDP. And you will know that the Office of Budget Responsibility said just the other day that if nothing changes, we're on course for 270% of GDP over the next 50 years. So I think that's what is worrying about the public finances. The in-year stuff that we've got, which suggests that there's going to be no reduction in public borrowing this year. We'll see what the OBR has to say at the time of the October 30 budget. But also the fact that there's no mechanism for controlling this. Really, we're into a period where demographics and other factors will tend to push debt up rather than give a good reason for debt to fall. So that is all quite concerning, I think. And of course, the tax burden is at its highest since the late 1940s. Effectively, its highest in peacetime, and due to go higher. We'll have to see. If it's another 15 to 20 billion of taxes in the October 30 budget. We're then looking at 38, 39% of GDP tax revenues, and we've never been there before. And the norm for the UK is to have tax revenues 33, 34% of GDP. We don't know when this cracks, and of course, the biggest element of that tax increase is the stealth tax of the long freeze on personal income tax allowances and thresholds. Some of you with long memories will, I was very pleased to get an email from Jeff Rooker the other day, Lord Rooker now, and he was the author in the 1970s, the co-author of what was called the Rooker-Wise Amendment when he was a Labour MP. And that amendment meant that every year income tax allowances and thresholds should rise in line with inflation unless primary legislation is introduced to prevent that. And of course, now we're in an extended period in which that is being prevented by primary legislation right through to 2028. A big stealth tax increase, biggest we've ever seen. The tax burden is going up. So the question is, what is going to be in the October 30 budget? When people like me say it's going to be painful, we're not making this up. We're just reflecting what the Prime Minister and Chancellor of the Exchequer have told us. They say it's going to be painful. Maybe there's a bit of a softening up. Maybe when the time comes, it'll be a little bit less painful than they have suggested. But sticking to the guns of something like removing the winter fuel payments for most pensioners, which raises a modest amount of money. 1.5 billion for quite a lot of political pain is an interesting decision. I think it's and they've got into the situation. They've carried it through the Labour conference, it seems, although there's going to be a vote on it tomorrow. But I don't think that vote will change anything. I think the fact that that has become a totem of their determination to show that they mean it when they say they're going to be fiscally responsible. We've taken a decision, doesn't raise much money, but it's politically difficult. and we're not a soft touch. We're not an easy touch, and that's why they've stuck to that. Now the question is, how do you get to 15 to 20 billion when you've ruled out most of the things that you could raise you decent amounts of money? What could raise you decent amounts of money are income tax, employees' national insurance, corporation tax, VAT. Those four I should say employees and employers' national insurance. Employers' national insurance has not been ruled out, by the way. So those are the four big taxes. You take those away, and it looks as though you're scrabbling around for that 15 to 20 billion in extra tax to put, as I say, more realistic spending plans in place. And I think alongside it, and part of the tough rhetoric is that there is going to be, of course, more public borrowing this year than was expected by the OBR in March. And I think that will be the excuse for that will be the fiscal inheritance. But what might it be? Now, I don't, the speculation about what might be in the budget, you see something every day on this. One difficult decision that Rachel Reeves probably does have to make, which will be politically unpopular and will be to get a bigger reaction from motorists than probably she's had from pensioners, is to restore the 5p duty cut that Rishi Sunak announced after the Russian invasion, and also to restore indexing of excise duties on petrol and diesel. Now, this hasn't been done, as you probably know, since 2011. It hasn't been done because successive chancellors have feared the backlash from motorists. But when it's not done, it's not even the case that this raises money to fill that black hole. That is assumed by the OBR to happen. It's assumed by the OBR to happen every year. If you don't do it, you're giving yourself a bigger black hole than you had before. So I think it's, if she didn't do that, I think she's got a big problem than she started. It won't raise a huge amount of money, about 5 billion, but it probably has to happen, and that would be unpopular. But looking around the other things, where do you get the money from? Now, I've leaned into quite a detailed analysis here that came from the Resolution Foundation. I mention them because they are very close to Labour, and I think have a reasonably good idea about which way Labour might be thinking on this. So, capital gains tax, you'll all know about. So what might they do on this? And this just sets out, John and Nick can share with you the slides afterwards. So don't feel you have to read all this now. But so you've got capital gains tax. One thing that Labour has said it will do is tax the carried interest, private equity carried interest, as income rather than capital gains. Whether that's unvarnished or whether there is some movement around that, where there are some concessions, we'll have to see. But as this sets out, there are more ways of raising income from capital gains tax than just doing that. One of them is the old entrepreneurs relief. You can adjust that upwards. Entrepreneurs relief, 10% at the moment. Business asset disposal relief, it's called at the moment. Capital gains tax on death and so on, or rolled over on death, as this sets out. So there is a decent amount. They say here that you get 8 billion, but they do emphasize that there may be behavioral responses to this. So, but you can raise a few billion from doing all these things. Now, I think these are the kind of things that the Treasury is currently looking at. I think it's inevitable there'll be something on capital gains tax. The smallest thing we'll see is the carried interest, but there are all these other things that can potentially happen. Some of which will affect the private rental market if they were to occur. So I think those are all worth watching out for. I think that is quite a big thing. Inheritance tax, again, this is something where the Resolution Foundation has run the numbers and said you could raise a decent amount, essentially by cutting reliefs, maybe getting rid of the residence, the additional nil rate ban for residences, and you could raise a few billion here. Again, there is money to be made here, and I think it seems to me that there will be some action on this. So, if pensioners are upset about winter fuel payments, they may be even more upset about, whatever the Chancellor has planned for this. But I think the point about these exercises is that, you have to scrabble around a bit in the smaller taxes to raise some decent amounts of revenue. But it's complicated, and you can do it. It makes for, in some ways, it's simple. Some of these things would simplify the tax system. In some ways, they'd make them even more complicated. But there is revenue to be raised. And another one, I don't particularly like this idea that the government could start levying employers' national insurance on employers' pension contributions. But this would explain the silence of ministers on the issue of employers' pension, employers' NI. They've ruled out doing anything to employees' NI, which Jeremy Hunt, of course, cut, but they haven't ruled out doing something on employers' NI. And one way of doing it was pension contribution. Another way would, of course, be to just look at tax relief on pensions. It has been floated quite a lot that you could replace higher rate pension tax relief, which does take a lot of the tax relief on pensions, with some kind of flat rate of about 30% or something. Other people, including the IFS, have said that would seriously reduce the incentive for people to contribute to pensions. So we'll have to see what happens. But there is, again, money to be raised there. I don't know which of these will make the cut. The point I'm making is we should be looking out for action in all these areas. Fuel duty, capital gains tax, inheritance tax, and pension tax relief. All of those are, all of these are potential feathers to be plucked by the Chancellor on October the 30th. What about interest rates? The third thing I want to talk about. We saw a massive flurry of interest rate hikes. I'm channeling Sherlock Holmes here with the dog that didn't bark. This dog is the real dog. He does bark, and the interest rate dog barked a lot since December 2021, when we saw the first of the sequence of Bank of England rate rises. And of course, we saw rates going up very substantially before the small cuts in August. Now, we've seen, as you will know, two very close votes for, in one case, when in September last year, the bank was widely expected to raise rates again from 5.25% to 5.5%. On a 5-4 vote, it voted to hold them. And of course, we had another 5-4 vote in August to cut them slightly to 5.25%, since which time the MPC has held them at 5.25%. Now, I was very pleased with both those decisions. One, but because sometimes I wouldn't pretend to get all these things right, but I'd called for the pause in September last year, and pause they did. And one of the reasons I called for a pause was that I was doing something with Charlie Bean, the former Bank of England deputy governor, and he's quite hawkish in general, but he said there was a good reason to wait and see for the reaction of previous rate rises before ploughing on, because during this sequence, as you will remember, the bank didn't allow a single meeting to go without raising rates, and so it looked like a panic catch up in terms of rate rises. And then we had of course the cut in August, the cut last month. So we have come down a little bit. Mortgage rates, I was going to say to John earlier, I'd like to know, I'd like to get good data on what's happening to buy-to-let mortgages, and I'm sure Landbay will provide me with some. But this is a Bank of England's data on new advances versus outstanding balances, and just shows, the banks are always criticised for not passing on rate, for not rewarding savers by enough when rates go up. But you can see, but it's quite a slow process before all their outstanding balances catch up in terms of rate rises. Now we're in a fixed rate era. It's different than it used to be. I was talking to some people earlier on, and it was young people who'd never experienced what we've all lived through in the past, or most of us lived through in the past, which was variable rate mortgages, where you could have a change in monthly payments, sometimes more than once a month when the bank chose to change rates very frequently and by substantial amounts some years ago. So it's different now. The housing market, I think, has been quite an interesting and resilient story over the past 2 or 3 years. When you go back to the autumn of 2022, when we had the Liz Truss quasi-Kwarteng mini budget, you had expectations of bank rate going to 6 or 7%, of mortgage rates at similar levels, all those mortgage products being withdrawn, and some of them not being replaced for quite some time. That moment, it looked as though the housing market had lost its visible means of support. We'd seen over a number of years affordability on the house price earnings measure getting more and more, housing becoming more and more unaffordable. But the only thing that kept it going was the fact we'd had zero official interest rates for so long. So when we moved to a higher interest regime very suddenly, it looked as though that prop had fallen and the housing market might suffer something of a calamity. As you can see, that hasn't happened. Transactions and approvals went down quite sharply for a while, and prices went down somewhat, but not substantially. But now they're recovering again. So I think all those fears that the MPC had during the long period when rates were, from March 2009 right through to I think it was May 2022, when bank rate never went above 75 basis points, because they feared what would happen to the economy if interest rates normalized. I think a lot of those fears were misplaced. The adjustment has happened quite, has just shown how that there was more resilience out there in the economy and the housing market than we perhaps had been led to expect. And I think that that is quite a positive outcome. Markets think a chart from the bank's monetary policy report in August, and you just see that there is an expectation that there are more rate rises to come, even though the approach is likely to be gradual. And obviously we saw a less gradualist approach from the Fed last week. I think where does bank rate in the UK end up? I think you think about what the Bank of England has always thought should be a kind of long-term real rate of interest, what is sometimes in the jargon called R star. It's about 1%, so 1% or so above the inflation target. We're talking about 3 to 3.5% a terminal rate for bank rate. Something probably quite similar in the US, a bit lower in the Eurozone. So there's quite a long downward trajectory for interest rates, I think. I think there's plenty more to come. The initial approach, given the narrowness of the vote to cut, has justifiably been cautious, but there's clearly more to come on this, beginning. And I have no reason to disagree with the general opinion that the next rate cut will come in November. But I think the 2010s, the long period of near zero interest rates were an aberration. It was an aberration built out of caution. There were plenty of opportunities where the bank could have normalized rates during that period. I'm thinking particularly, 2014, 2015, the economy was growing quite well. We hadn't then had the referendum. Things were okay. The financial crisis was starting to fade in the memory. I think rates could have gone up then. They didn't. I think central banks were a bit overcautious. I mentioned at the bottom there, we could have shocks again, in which case, all bets are off. But I think we'll look back on that period and think, how the hell did that happen? How did we have such a long period of zero interest rates when, if you'd asked anybody, a few years before that, what will be the consequences of zero interest rates for such a prolonged period, they would have said, we'll just have a bout of mega inflation. We didn't quite get that. We had the inflation, during the pandemic and Russian invasion, but not then. What did we learn from the bank most recently when it chose to hold rates? Well, Dave Ramsden, who had accompanied Swati Dhingra in voting for a cut before it happened, chose to join the majority this time. I think there are still worries there about service sector inflation. Service sector inflation has moved around quite a lot, reflecting, hotel prices for Taylor Swift concerts, etc. Went down from 5.9 to 5.2% and has gone back up to 5.6%. So that's still a bit of a worry for the bank, because they always think of service sector inflation as domestically generated inflation. That's the kind of thing that reflects the impact of their policy on the economy. But there are good reasons to think that core inflation and service sector inflation will come down. And the bank has got a little bit more optimistic about where inflation will go in the remaining months of this year. It had thought 2.75% by the end of the year. It now thinks 2.5%. And that is pretty much entirely an energy effect, the higher energy price cap that we'll see in October. And I think the bank is secretly quite pleased with the way that pay is going. Settlements are now running about 4%. The message it's getting from its own decision maker panel is that settlements are coming down again, and that seems to me the way it is going. That people felt the cost of living crisis, they wanted compensation for that, but I think we've come out of it with the kind of pre-pandemic, pre-Russian invasion norm reasserting itself for pay rises in general. There's a bit of public sector catch-up going on, and we've seen those quite big public sector pay increases. But I think we'll settle down at something like where we were before the crisis, and that seems to me the way it is going. And the bank is quite pleased about that. So that will pave the way for more rate cuts, I think. Just to finish, I wanted to talk about just two things which may be of interest to you. One is the target of building 1.5 million new homes over the course of this parliament. Very ambitious target. And if we look at the record, I mean, as I'm sure will know, you don't get to anything like that unless you've got large numbers of council houses being built, local authority properties being built. The capacity of the private sector, private house builders, is roughly 200,000 new homes a year, and that if anything, it will take time for them to get to that. They cut back quite sharply during after the Trussonomics shock. Most house builders, in fact, are building fewer new homes this year than last year. So getting back to even the 200,000 will take time. There is another measure of housing supply, which you probably know about, which is net additional dwellings. And net additional dwellings is new completions, new homes being built, but also conversions. And I think we might see this idea of net additional dwellings coming back into focus quite a lot more over the course of this parliament. So it means conversions from office or retail use into residential, and that's been running quite strong. I mean, you see it's running quite strong in recent years. It doesn't get you to 300,000, but it got us almost to 250,000 just before the crisis, and even in 2020, 2019, 2020. So I think these are fiscal years here. So these are there is scope there, and I think we might see quite a lot more of that. And I know a lot of institutional landlords are quite interested in this market, as they are in prefabricated homes, factory built housing, which can help you bypass some of the the constraints on supply of conventional house building. So there is, I think we'll see a bit more of that. I still think that 1.5 million new homes, even on this measure, over the course of this parliament, is not going to be achieved. It's going to be well below that. But there's no reason to believe we won't see more net housing supply over the next few years. The growth is the big challenge for this government. Growth is the elixir which helps the public finances, helps the market. One of this seems to me, is just the most astonishing comparison. It explains so much. Real GDP per head has increased by 5 to 6% over the last 16 years. Over the previous 16 years, it increased by more than 45%. That is such a pronounced drop in the increase in prosperity. It's explained by the fact we haven't had much productivity growth over the past few years. But it feeds back into real wage stagnation. Real wages have only just gone above where they were in the early part of 2008. And there is so much you can read across for this, kind of dissatisfaction with, with governments, with political parties. Maybe the Brexit vote was because people felt squeezed and, they're disappointed. Prosperity wasn't coming through. How do we get more prosperity? It explains why the previous government had to have a leveling up agenda to try and spread, the growth that we had more evenly. May even explain the riots that we had, last month. So it's just astonishing. I mean, I'm pretty confident that the next 5 years will be better in terms of economic growth than the last 5 years, and that's of course what the OBR and others expect. But that's mainly because the last 5 years were so dreadful. We had the worst parliament for living standards, for real GDP growth and GDP per head growth that we've had, I think, ever. So it's got to improve. But this is, it didn't just start in 2019. This has been a period of pretty flat economic activity as it affects people in real GDP per head. And you look at the record since, just to illuminate that point, the record since pre-pandemic, Q4 2019. The ambition is to be the fastest growing economy in the G7. You just see how far ahead America is there. The Biden stimulus, the Inflation Reduction Act, all those things has made a massive difference. I mean, it hasn't particularly helped. It didn't particularly help him out politically, but and voters only know what's happening in their own economy. They don't really compare it. But the UK is about to have an upward revision of GDP when we get the new Blue Book, and so we'll look probably similar to Japan, maybe just still a little bit below France. But the only comfort there is that Germany is doing even less well. And I think the German story there has a lot to do with car manufacturing. You've seen, Volkswagen announcing, factory closures, potential factory closures, and so on. And what Germany, I think, did not allow for, and obviously you've seen difficulties for the German government with the rise of AfD and so on. Germany did not expect China to become the world leader for electric vehicles. They thought that they would naturally, things would naturally migrate from internal combustion engine to electric vehicles. In fact, China is doing incredibly well there, and the German industrial model, German industrial machine, is really struggling. So there's a real problem there at the heart of Europe. So, but for the UK to get to the top of that G7 growth league looks optimistic to me. So it needs growth to be much better than anybody is predicting for the UK over the next few years. Got a big uncertainty about November with the US election. I think the choice that American voters have got is slightly more palatable than it was when Joe Biden was still running. But you've got Kamala Harris, who's candidate by default, really. I mean, once they got rid of Biden, it would have been difficult to get anybody else into that position. And you've got Trump, who's determined to be even more protectionist than he was last time if he gets elected again. So So none of that fills me with great optimism, I have to say, what's happening in the US. But that's up to US voters. We have to see what happens then. So I think there is plenty to think about. There's it's an interesting time. Interesting time, as I'm sure it is for you, and particularly with the uncertainty over the October 30th budget. We've got to hope that there aren't too many of those shocks, too many of those black swans around. These, by the way, are real black swans. If anybody, I don't get commission from the National Trust, but if any of you have a spare afternoon and you're not living too far away, if you go to Chartwell, which is Winston Churchill's home in Kent, there's some lovely black swans there, which were gifted to him in the 1920s. We have to hope that real black swans are very attractive, but we don't want any more of those big economic shocks. And we have to keep counting those skips. For those of you who've heard these things before, many people favour crane counts on city landscape, and so I always favoured the skip index, which is based on the number of builder skips in my street. When there are none at all, we're in recession. There's no growth. When there are two, we're growing in line with what economists would call trend growth. And when there are four, it's a sustainable boom. I think I may have told you before that the pandemic played havoc with the skip index. We went from 0 when the pandemic hit to more than 4 when everybody wanted an office built in their loft or in the garden because they thought they'd be working from home forever. But now it's settled down. There are 2 skips in the street. I'm not saying that everything is perfect, but it's things are just about where they should be. And on that note, I'll hand back to John. I'll stop showing these slides, and we'll hopefully have some discussion. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you very much for that, David. If we could start on the UK, just sort of think about it. It's been sort of commented a little bit in the last 2 days, but obviously since the election, so for the last 6 or 7 weeks, 2.5 months or so, there's been obviously Reeves and Starmer. It's been just doom and gloom, and that's obviously been a tactic they decided to just to say how bad things are and to prepare us for that painful budget on October 30th. You get a sense in the last 48 hours that they've realised they've overdone it, and we were talking earlier, but is this having an impact on sentiment, business confidence, consumer confidence, where people or businesses delay decisions or they sell shares because they're worried about capital gains tax and their capital gains, and then ultimately this is actually going to harm growth in the decisions that people take now, whether it be to buy things or to invest, etc., will have an impact on growth in either end of this year or early 2025. Do you get the sense that they've made a mistake there, but how important is sentiment generally to growth?
Yeah, no, I think it's very important. And one of the things that I think you're right on the change of tone, because I think they thought they were speaking to an audience of voters and an audience of politicians. I mean, Labour has been smarting since 2010 because the Tories kept whipping out that famous letter from Liam Byrne. He was Chief Secretary of the Treasury under Alistair Darling, and he left the "there's no money left" note, and that even featured in this year's election campaign. So they've been desperate for revenge by that. But I think they thought, well, we're just speaking to voters here. The voters are consumers, and voters are business people as well. So everybody's heard that message. You saw the slump in the GfK measure of consumer confidence, which I think was real. People are worried. As businesses are holding off decisions until they see what's in that budget. And once you do that, if you've held off, then you have to have a reason to start again. And the budget, even if it's not as bad as some of the language has implied, it's not going to be a kind of green flag. Let's go, let's go UK. It's going to be wonderful. So I think I think the messaging was ridiculously gloomy. It was a political message, and I think they've succeeded in scaring everybody, and I think it was fine to do that for a couple of weeks, but to keep it going, and there was quite a lot of that still in Rachel Reeves's speech yesterday. So I think it has misfired, and I say once you stop people doing things, once you give people reason for delay, then it's it carries on. So even I don't know how many cruises have been cancelled because pensioners won't be getting their winter fuel payments, but some people just see, well, I'm not going to get that money. I'm in trouble. It's for most pensioners, it's not a fortune, and they are still going to get a reasonable state pension increase next April. And a lot of pensioners don't rely solely on the state pension, but just the language and the mood has been all wrong, I think. And so, and you see it in you see it in the consumer confidence, you see it in the purchasing managers index just this week. So I think they did miscalculate on that. I think they allowed politics to go slightly too much to their heads. It was terrible messaging, I think, really.
And on the sort of growth agenda, they've obviously talked a lot about planning, and so it looks like a large part or a significant part of the growth plans is linked to building houses. As you say, that's going to take a couple of, if they can do it, it's still going to be 2026, 2027 till we see that, or even later till those houses or apartments, whatever, get built. And other than that, there's been lots of mention of the words growth, but there hasn't been, any other meaningful things. And, they're obviously employers' national insurance. Again, that would probably be an anti-growth method. Capital gains tax potentially would reduce investment. And so are you expecting, and obviously you mentioned the extra 30 billion that they're looking to raise in the budget. I assume, therefore, they're going to want to invest that because they need to have some other growth strategy other than housing. And I read a report, a couple of days ago, just saying how bad the UK is relative, not just to America, but to rest of Europe and Asia in terms of infrastructure projects and how far we're behind, whether it be the cost of building railways, the cost of building electricity or nuclear power generation, and how little we do. And the fact that Heathrow being another example where we seem to have dithered. And would you expect any surprise there where actually there is a serious sort of element of public investment in the budget? Or do you think that those extra taxes are just going to feed through into the usual, more nurses, more doctors, et cetera, et cetera?
No, I think they have to bring in they have to encourage and one of the if Rachel Reeves was to leave the existing public investment plans in place, which at the moment are being squeezed by inflation. They were, you remember that Rishi Sunak, when he became Chancellor in February 2020, inherited infrastructure plans from Sajid Javid, and Sajid Javid was the author of those. Another time he said, I remember him saying to me at number 11 breakfast, we've been mad not to borrow when it's been so cheap for government to borrow to invest, and that's why there was this 600 billion of extra infrastructure investment, which he conjured up and Rishi Sunak announced. And then gradually, during the pandemic and after the Russian invasion, that has been scaled back. So I think there has to be that. And you're quite right. We now look lame when it comes to infrastructure investment. You go to Spain, you get Spanish railways, fantastic. They do it more cheaply, more efficiently, more quickly than we do in terms of building this infrastructure and these infrastructure projects. The difficulty is, borrowing is borrowing. So if you're going to meaningfully improve infrastructure, you probably do need more of a input from the institutions. You need more pension fund investment in infrastructure, more insurance company investment in infrastructure. We've got the mad situation in the UK now where there's quite a lot of infrastructure investment in legacy infrastructure in from pension funds, but it's Canadian pension funds, Australian pension funds who are doing it. UK pension funds do a limited amount of that. So I think we need to see that. And the other difficulty is there's no way of kind of at the moment, unless the Treasury got very clever way of doing this, of separating borrowing for investment from borrowing for general purposes, pay day-to-day services and so on. So they need to square that circle in some way. I think it has to be done, but it suffers, John, from the same problem that you were talking about. The initial effects of infrastructure spending does generate construction jobs. We haven't got enough construction workers anyway. It does generate activity while it's occurring, but the benefits from infrastructure only come when it's built, and it takes we take a long time to build it. And on the housing thing, I'm skeptical of all this. We'll still have, despite Keir Starmer's promise to bulldoze through planning rules and so on, you'll still have all those things about rare newts, local objections, local planning, getting anything through our planning system. A government can't, from number 10 and 11, say, forget all that. This is a new era. You can't change the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act and say, and all those things that we've had for a long time, and say this is different. This is year zero for planning. It's still going to take a long time. You talk to house builders, and they will say it's their biggest constraint, and I think it will only gradually become less of a constraint. So none of those things are going to generate growth. And the thing about I think Labour is basing slightly unrealistic expectations on the benefits of what it would describe as stability. When Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt were there, we had, we didn't know perhaps enough about the state of the public finances, but there wasn't the kind of instability we had in the brief period where Liz Truss was Prime Minister. They were a couple of sensible guys in charge. You haven't suddenly moved from them to Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, and you've suddenly got massive stability. Rishi Sunak may not have survived very long. There may have been a coup against him, and that's not going to happen with Keir Starmer. But I think they're placing an unrealistic premium on the idea that a more stable government will mean much stronger economic growth. It's had some effects. Sterling is quite strong at the moment, and I think international investors are a little bit more confident that they've got a government which is not going to fall apart in the next few weeks or even the next few years. But I don't know how big the growth benefit is going to be from
that. So, David, we've got literally a minute left, and I've got lots of other questions about the budget and productivity, which we don't have time to answer. So, and rather, unfortunately, obviously, a lot of what we discussed about has been quite negative in terms of growth, and obviously October the 30th and what that might mean. So, with a minute to go, I'm putting you on the spot here. What is the positive news? What can we sort of look forward to? What do you think the government will do right? You said that you felt growth was going to pick up over the next 4 years, but obviously from a low base. So give us something positive before we break for lunch.
Yeah, the positives. First positive, John, is the one I touched on when I was talking about the housing market. It applies to the economy in general. We've had an adjustment that people thought was going to be more painful than it was to higher interest rates. The norm for interest rates, the OBR, don't we remember, once did a kind of alternative scenario in which Charlie Bean developed when he was at the OBR, in which bank rate would go to the dizzy heights of 3%. And the economic effects of that were going to be quite difficult, and the housing market effects were going to be quite difficult. We've seen interest rates go much higher than that. And I think the economy is showing itself to be, and the housing market showing themselves to be quite resilient. So that's good news. I think we still have a lot of strength. We are still good at the things that matter in the modern economy. We're good at business services. We're good at financial services. We can be good at, fintech, a whole set of professional services we do very well. Those are the areas which is going to, where world trade is going to grow over the next few years. It's a good job, I shouldn't say this coming from the West Midlands. It's a good job we're not reliant on motor manufacture anymore, given what's happening to China and electric vehicles and so on. So I think that's positive. And as I say, we're not going to have as grim a time. We're going to have quite a good time for growth. Inflation's down, real wages are growing again. We can put a lot of the nightmares of the last few years behind us. And I think that's all quite positive. I think we're into an era of modest real wage growth. And I hope we're also in an era where productivity finally kicks in. I mean, the one thing just one thing I'd say about, while we've got time, governments can throw lots of things at at an economic solution. Think of business investment. We invest less than most of our competitors. 10% of GDP in the UK, business investment, 40% in most other countries. And they've tried everything. They've tried reducing corporation tax to the lowest in the G20. That didn't stimulate business investment. We've tried, we've tried full expensing. Full expensing is in place for qualifying business investment. Again, you're not seeing a business investment revolution as a result of that. Sometimes you just have to let it happen. And I think, business investment should pick up. There are reasons to invest in the UK. And the final thing I'd say is that, Labour will do this very slowly, but I think they will build up closer relations with the EU. I think we will no longer be as cut off from European supply chains and the European market as we have been over the past few years. The hostility, the one positive change of government effect is that, Tory prime ministers were fearful of anything that suggested closer relations with the EU. I mean, this is obviously between you, me, and the people who are listening, but we once had a private session with Jeremy Hunt when he was waxing lyrical about building closer relations with the EU and a Swiss-style arrangement and so on. And my colleagues put it on the front page of the paper the following Sunday, and Jeremy was almost had to step down as chancellor, because it was so controversial within the Tory party. It isn't that controversial within Labour. I'm not saying we're going to rejoin, but I certainly think we'll have closer and more productive relations with the EU, and that's a good thing, I think, to have over the next few years. I hope that's positive enough. I didn't want to drive you all into depression, so I hope that's
fantastic. And also, the pound is now not far off £1, not far off 134, which also implies that some people want to invest in the UK.
Exactly.
So that's good. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and particularly thank you again, David, for having a really sort of insightful hour. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks, John.